In the early hours of a warm summer's morning on Sunday the 31st of August 1997, in the world's most romantic city, Paris, Diana, the Princess of Wales, tragically died in a horrific car crash. She was 36 years old. A family mourned, a nation wept. It seemed that the heart of the world stopped. Born at Park House, Sandringham, on July the 1st, 1961, Diana Frances Spencer was the third daughter of one of Britain's most historic families. Her birth is reported to have been greeted with disappointment by her father, who had longed for a boy. Her parents divorced when she was only 6. It was a lonely childhood, and one she later vowed her own children would never endure.
The Spencer household was not a happy one. And Di's childhood memories were often tearful. She would sit at the foot of the stairs with her 2 elder sisters, their hands cupped over their ears as their parents argued, and eventually she saw her mother walk from the front door of the Spencer home forever.
Having 2 parents at war does have a very traumatic effect on a child, and Diana was a particularly sensitive little girl. And I think it was an effect that would last with her through adult life, because even though when parents split up they take great pains to say to a child, well, Mummy and Daddy still love you, the child still feels rejected and unloved, and they somehow blame themselves for why their parents are no longer with them. And of course Diana and her brother and other 2 sisters were bounced between one parent and another. And maybe this kind of very insecure childhood stayed with Diana through all her life and had a very, very long-lasting effect. And it probably does explain an awful lot of Diana's continued feeling to want to be loved by people and to give a lot of love, because it was, I think, a throwback to this awfully sad childhood.
Diana went to boarding school in West Heath in Kent. She was not an academic girl, but excelled at sport. After a spell at a Swiss finishing school, at 17 she came back to London to look for work.
Diana was obviously a lovely girl, but she wasn't, to be fair, really equipped for any kind of high-powered career when she sort of left her varying nannying jobs and she left home. So I suppose because of her upbringing, the natural path to follow was working with children. Because of her own upsets and trauma, Diana had a very big insight into the mind of a child. She'd be the first one to pick out a child who looked lonely or unhappy. She'd be the first one to take a child's hand, and indeed children would follow her. She was at one time called the Pied Piper, and children would naturally go towards Diana. I think an interesting story is the fact that when she went to a friend's sports day, all the little girls won prizes except this one particular little child, and Diana noticed this and went over, and she created her own little ribbon and gave it to the little girl. And I think that's a very sort of telling insight into Diana's mind, that working with children, her love with children, and a love that later came out with her own sons, it was just inevitable, I think.
The Spencer and Windsor families had always been very close. Earl Spencer had been equerry to the Queen's father, George VI. And for their early years, the Spencers had lived on the Queen's Sandringham estate, so it was not unusual for the Queen to pop in for a cup of tea. Neither was it unusual when they moved to Althorp Hall in Northamptonshire for Prince Charles to drop by. In fact, he dropped by for a pheasant shoot. But bagging pheasants wasn't everything that was on his mind. He was actually looking to bag a bride.
Press rumours started to spread about the growing relationship between Charles and the young Diana Spencer. In 1980, Charles travelled to Zimbabwe for the independence ceremony and subsequent celebrations. Camilla Shand, now Parker Bowles, travelled as his official escort. Charles returned to woo the young Diana Spencer. Their romance became common knowledge that summer until their engagement was announced in February 1981, with Diana sporting a beautiful £28,000 diamond and sapphire engagement ring.
It was not a normal courtship by any modern standards. On the one hand, Prince Charles was under pressure to find a bride, from his parents particularly, because they were anxious to see him married.
Charles, I think, had been sent out to catch a virgin. He'd been told it was time to settle down and start having children.
When Prince Charles decided he was going to marry Diana, The person who gave him her unqualified support and, in a way, permission was Camilla.
Even way back when Charles and Diana had just got engaged and the marriage was announced and the wedding presents started to come in, Princess Diana was absolutely devastated to find a package in Charles's private quarters which she thought was a wedding present to them both. And when she opened it, she found out in fact it was a present from Camilla, a private present, a personal present from Camilla to Charles. And I think then she perhaps got an inkling that she's up against a very difficult battle, that there was one woman who would always be in the shadow of their marriage.
They were married in July 1981, and to begin with, they were clearly happy. True, Charles may not have been the most conventional of romantic husbands, but the newlyweds were obviously in love, and it was only gradually to become clear that Charles would be upstaged by his beautiful wife. Diana became pregnant almost immediately. Prince William was born in June the next year, and it wasn't too long after the birth of William that commentators noticed that Diana was looking painfully thin.
Bulimia is an eating disorder. It's not unlike anorexia, which more people have heard of. Now, in anorexia, people starve themselves until they get really, really thin. Sometimes they, I'm afraid, starve themselves to death. In bulimia, it's rather harder to detect because quite often the woman concerned, and it is nearly always a woman, is of average weight. You wouldn't know anything was wrong by looking at her.
Charles's lack of rapport with his young wife became increasingly apparent. In 1982, Charles arrived for the Remembrance Day ceremony at the Royal Albert Hall alone, saying his wife was not well. Yet 5 minutes later, Diana arrived. Things went from bad to worse, with claims of suicide attempts.
Many things went wrong in the marriage. First of all, he fell out of love with her, or, as he'd never been in love with her, love evaporated.
They didn't like each other. It was quite clear they didn't like each other. There was no affection. They weren't tactile. There was no more touching. There were no more affectionate pats on the bottom from him to her. And they would arrive at places and split. And their backs to each other. And he, of course, felt this very strongly because he knew that she was upstaging him all the time.
The birth of their second child, Prince Harry, in 1984, kept up the pretense that all was well. In public, they mastered the art of putting on a united front, but behind the facade, things continued to deteriorate. Diana felt a stranger in her own home. In 1986, on a tour of Canada, proof positive emerged that the marriage was effectively over. In Vancouver, attending the Expo World Fair, the princess, clearly suffering from the effects of her bulimia, fainted in public.
Charles didn't rush to her side. He told her to pull herself together and to make herself presentable for that evening's festivities. Charles's utter frustration with his sham marriage came about 5 years into it. At that time, he'd given up the one love of his life, Camilla. He'd stayed with Diana for those 5 years. After 5 years, he went back to Camilla, and she became his comfort, his shoulder to cry on. I think it's significant that whenever Princess Diana visited Highgrove after an absence when Charles had been there, she would walk straight over to the telephone and press the redial button. At the end of the line was the Parker Bowles household on every occasion.
The abiding images of royalty in the late 80s are frivolous ones. On the ski slopes, at Ascot, at work and at play, the youngsters could be seen to be having a good time. But behind those frivolous images, the reality was very different. Diana has blamed the friendship of Charles and Camilla Parker Bowles for contributing to her unhappiness. But many royal watchers think that is not entirely fair. Diana herself was soon to reach a turning point in her life, on a skiing trip with Charles to Cloisters. After a photo call, she decided not to continue skiing, a decision which may have saved her life. Within hours, a close friend was dead and another critically injured.
Diana was friends with the wife. It was much more of a personal involvement for Charles than Diana. She was, of course, broken up by the tragedy because she saw a friend of hers who was pregnant losing her husband. And on that very same holiday, Catherine Soames had run off with another man who'd been married 4 times. So there were other ramifications of the Cloisters holidays which have never gone into, which gave Diana also food for thought and for feeling that perhaps life was very unfair.
By the end of the 1980s, Charles and Diana were virtually living separate lives. It was only a matter of time before something dramatic occurred. What was remarkable was the nature of the event and how it came to the attention of the public. The effects were staggering and contributed to the crisis that was already facing the House of Windsor.
The Princess of Wales was spending the New Year holiday, 1989-1990, at Sandringham with her children, her husband, and the rest of the senior royals. And she did what it appeared was her habit of an evening. She got on the phone.
Diana Gate tapes, I believe, in fact, I am certain, were the work of a very deep and sinister dirty tricks department. Nothing will ever persuade me that these tapes came out by accident. I believe the people who did reveal them didn't really know what it was all about.
In 1990, the rift between Charles and Diana was highlighted when he fell off a horse playing polo. The princess was in London when the news reached her that he had broken his arm in 2 places. Diana was in a quandary. She knew she should rush to his side, but it is reported she couldn't be bothered. They were now openly unhappy together, and they chose to spend most of their time apart.
The time Charles had his polo accident, Diana had had time to take stock of the marriage, and she'd gone through a very, very bad period with Charles.
The royal family weren't very much help to Prince Charles in his time of agony and the breakdown of his marriage. His father certainly might have taken some enjoyment from it. His mother was unable to help simply because Charles never asked her.
I primarily blame Charles for not entering the marriage in a modern, acceptable way and not giving his princess the full scope that she should have had in the early years, and reaching a stage where she became not just a competitor, but then an adversary. And really, it was his fault.
Charles is so staid, such a young old fogey set in his ways, that Diana found herself totally reliant on her own devices, on her own friends. She couldn't hold a serious conversation with Charles or his friends. They're all intellectuals.
The business about the Morton book is fascinating, because I don't believe that Andrew, whom I know well, ever set out to write that book. I think he set out with the dream of writing a different kind of book, and suddenly all this material was given to him by acquiescence of those that have now been named as sources, and certainly they would never have done so without the princess's tacit approval.
Did Diana really attempt suicide? Did she try to kill herself 4 or 5 times, as sometimes been claimed? I think not.
After their separation announcement, Charles and Diana had hoped that the pressure on them would ease. It did not. And the most explosive bombshell to hit the royal family was yet to come. His name was James Hewitt. Hewitt had been introduced to Diana at a dinner party in 1985, and sometime shortly after that, they became lovers.
The affair was only fully revealed in the autumn of 1994, when a book was written about Hewitt, largely discredited and certainly disbelieved by Diana's close friends and supporters. But it was true. Diana had had a love affair with James Hewitt, James who shortly afterwards became known as the Cad Hewitt, and she was forced to confess that in an hour-long television special in 1995, and this is what she said. The interviewer asked her, "Did your relationship go beyond a close friendship?" Diana, "Yes, it did, yes." "Were you unfaithful?" And Diana said of Hewitt, "Yes, I adored him. Yes, I was in love with him, but I was very let down." And indeed she was.
But I think if you look at James Hewitt, he's what us British would call sort of the chinless wonder, very much an army wimp of a man. There's no doubting he loved her and Diana loved him, But I don't think it was actually a very sort of intellectual relationship. It was a physical one. She was a very lonely woman looking for something. But I think James Hewitt obviously is another one who betrayed her trust. He liaised with Anna Pasnak to write the book Princess in Love, which, although it came across as a romantic novel, and everybody sneered at it at the time, saying, what a lot of rubbish, how could this have happened, how could wonderful Diana have sullied herself? But of course, it was proved right a couple of years later, when in fact, when Diana said, yes, we had the affair, and in more interviews with James Hewitt, it did become clear that a lot of this fictional book, as it was in fact true. She did, in fact, lead him by the hand and take him to bed, which I think was sort of quite remarkable, and I think it probably shows another side to Diana as well.
Diana's frank confession on television of an adulterous affair with James Hewitt, and her further criticisms of the House of Windsor in the same interview, was seen by many royal observers as a declaration of war by her on the whole royal family. It was therefore no surprise when the Queen, who was in despair at the unprecedented damage being done to the monarchy, soon after ordered the divorce of Charles and Diana. Diana had agreed to a divorce. At last, she felt free and appeared determined to create a new life for herself.
This was like a new beginning, a new dawn for Diana. She strove to establish herself as an international stateswoman, an ambassador for Britain, she called it, a queen of people's hearts. She got precious little help from the palace and even less from the royal courtiers.
As Diana's brother was to very pointedly say at her funeral, Diana needed no royal title to weave her magic. She became a rather self-appointed ambassador for Britain, but I think looking back, that was such the wisest choice she could have made. People still loved her, and I think she was loved more than anywhere else in America. People still paid thousands of dollars just to not only sit by her side, but attend the very same function that Diana was attending. And you're not talking about small informal gatherings where they had the chance to speak to her, but vast, vast gatherings where people just wanted to be in her presence, so that it was an amazing aura she had. And I think one can understand why perhaps Diana was seriously thinking about settling in America, because she was faultless there. People didn't criticise her. They loved her for what she was. She was completely blameless. And I think you can understand her wanting to be in an environment where they thought perhaps, this is a girl for us, we love her. She can only continue to weave her magic for us.
Diana was also determined to fill her life with her charity work. It seemed to be her release, her way of filling her life. She decided to give her love, for it must have seemed that receiving it was forever going to elude her. Diana's plan was to put the enormous worldwide fascination with her to good use. She chose to use the hordes of photographers in a productive way as they followed her around the world. This and her excellent communication skills meant that she soon became one of the most successful fundraisers ever. At one stage, Diana was associated with some 150 charities and was president or patron of more than 90. Indeed, when she severed links with all but 6 of them, officials estimated that it would cost them a staggering £300 million. Her name remained, however, in backing many of them. Diana concentrated on her special 6 charities, including the leprosy mission, to which she made substantial personal donations as well as raising its profile.
Diana threw herself wholeheartedly into her charity work, sometimes publicly, but more often in private, often secretly, often at night. She would visit hospitals and hold the hands of dying cancer patients. She'd visit hospices. She even took her sons, William and Harry, to a hostel for the homeless one night, secretly, without publicity.
I met her twice, and you couldn't meet a better person, you know. She was just fantastic. I mean, she did things for the homeless people that nobody else could do. And she had time for you, you know. She sat there for hours. She spoke about what you wanted to talk about. If you asked her personal questions, she'd answer them. She was a really, really nice lady, you know. And her kids as well, I met her 2 kids. She brought her kids in '96 to a hostel in Euston, another cold weather. And William, Harry, they're really, really good kids. And that's who I really feel sorry for.
From the moment that she cuddled an AIDS victim and the moment that she held a leper's hand, Diane became very much a leading light in charity work. She was like a breath of fresh air, really, because the royal family up until that point had never really been involved in tactile. They never actually cuddled people who were sick. They might go visit them, but never sat on their bedside. And I think this was sort of quite a new dimension. This is probably why people took Diana to their hearts and why she was called Queen of Hearts.
Diana was determined to get involved in charities that were not glossy. Her early involvement in HIV and AIDS charities is now recognised as changing a nation's perception of the disease. And it was Diana's work with children's charities that gave us such memorable images. She had time for everybody and lit up a room when she entered it. She gave her full backing to the plight of landmine sufferers, travelling to Angola and Bosnia to see for herself the devastation landmines cause. When she flew to Angola, one of the world's most heavily mined countries, to highlight the campaign, she finally believed she had achieved her stated aim of linking the public's unending fascination with her to making a tangible difference to the lives of others. I hope, she told the press pack who followed her, that by working together we shall focus world attention on this vital, but until now largely neglected, issue. Her visit was clouded in controversy when a Conservative minister branded her a loose cannon, and others accused her of being uninformed about the landmines issue. But although Diana was initially shocked and dismayed at the row that she had unwittingly stirred up, she refused to let it shake her determination to try to solve the horrific problem. "All I'm trying to do is help," she said. She was a guiding light to all the charities she supported.
Another of Diana's main concerns, of course, was to protect the children, and she's always aware that some damning press report might come out which would hurt them. So she'd always, if a particular damning report was due, she'd go down to see William at school and say, "William, this is the situation. Please don't believe what you're going to read. Mummy and Daddies do still love you. Whatever is said in the papers will always be here for you. Don't believe these lies." And an interesting fact was that as William grew older, the roles seemed to reverse somewhat, and Diana was no longer the one that supported him. He became a shoulder to cry on. He actually became very grown up, and he would sort of advise his own mother on how to sort of deal with the press, how to be a little bit stronger. And I'm sure there were many times he'd sort of say, "Mummy, please don't cry. We love you very much. You know, be strong for us, and I'll always be there for you."
Diana's immersion in her charity work and her devotion to her two sons was almost overshadowed by her love-hate relationship with the world's press, especially the paparazzi.
Diana knew very well how to manipulate the press to her own advantage and to the advantage of her charities. But it was a two-way thing. She couldn't take the pressure of the constant attention, which after all had been upon her since she was just 17 or 18 years of age. And eventually it became all too much. She would often be photographed running tearful away from the cameras, not smiling at them.
And you heard horrendous stories of paparazzi who would crawl on stomachs to get under windows. There was this great network of wherever she went on a plane, somebody would be tipped off. Every private visit to a doctor, somebody would be tipped off, somebody would be waiting there. And I think it must have taken its toll. I'm very surprised that she wasn't completely unhinged by it, because to have that amount of pressure would not do anybody any good, no matter how gorgeous Diana always looked for the cameras.
With the continual hounding by the press, it was only a matter of time before the world would discover that Diana had possibly, at long last, finally found love.
She was photographed in August 1997 in the south of France with Dodi Fayed, the film producer son of Mohammed Al Fayed, owner of London store Harrods.
The two were very, very close, and in fact they'd known each other a lot longer than the press would lead us to believe. Diana was introducing Dodi as her boyfriend, several months before the press latched onto it. And they're very tactile, they're very loving, very cuddling, and perhaps that's what Diana missed and that's what she wanted.
She was making no secret of the fact that she was at last in love. In the early hours of Sunday, August the 31st, 1997, Diana and Dodi, having dined at the Ritz Hotel in Paris, stepped into the back of a Mercedes and were driven at high speed to Dodi's Paris home. The Mercedes swept into an underpass beside the River Seine and lost control. The driver and Dodi died instantly. A 3-hour operation ensued in a Paris hospital, a battle for Diana's life. And at 4 o'clock in the morning, the doctors announced that they had failed. Within minutes, the news wires around the world were running red hot with the news that nobody could have predicted and no one wanted to believe.
Within hours of Diana's death, tributes were pouring in from people around the world. Instead of the usual exaggerated messages of sympathy, the tributes to Diana were direct and personal, to a woman who sincerely wanted to help those who needed it most. Tens of thousands camped out overnight to pay Diana their final respects. The streets of London were packed with crowds comparable to those on VE Day in 1945. Many wept openly, unashamed to show their sorrow. Most, though, simply stood in silence, heads bowed, alone with their thoughts and prayers for the woman they had never known, but who touched their lives so profoundly. The unique Diana was breaking traditions even now, on her funeral day. The Queen bowed as Diana's coffin passed, and Britain's National Union flag rose above the palace for the first time ever, before it was lowered to half-mast. Never before had a country mourned so openly.
The moment that we heard the news, Britain reacted in a way that I don't think history will ever see again. The style of mourning was phenomenal. I mean, people came in droves to London to stand outside Diana's home and Buckingham Palace and to cry for the princess that they loved. And I think that it was interesting that because Diana was very much the people's princess, those people reacted in the way that she would have expected, from the heart. The tears were real. They weren't ashamed to show their emotion.
There was a spontaneous outpouring of grief by the British public, and then of anger, at first directed against the paparazzi who, again, had been pursuing Diana that night, the night of her death, then against the driver of the car, who, it appeared, had been drinking, and finally, and astonishingly, against the royal family themselves, against the senior members, against the Queen. The British public felt that the Queen had not adequately shown her own grief. The family was tucked away safely in Balmoral. Charles had come to London, his sons had come to London to see their mother's body, but the Queen had not. And it was a critical moment for the House of Windsor. Eventually, the public won. The Queen, Prince Philip, and the rest of the royals did come down, and the flag was at last flown at half-mast on top of Buckingham Palace.
On the stroke of 9, 6 horses and soldiers from the King's Troop and the Welsh Guards walked into the gaze of over 2 billion people worldwide. And in London, over 2 million people had come to say goodbye to their princess. When the funeral cortege reached St. James's Palace, it was joined by the Princes William and Harry and Diana's brother Charles, who had taken such an active role in the planning of the day. Behind them walked 500 charity workers. The service at Westminster Abbey was attended by 1,800 of Diana's friends. Celebrities, charity workers and heads of state all came together. Her brother wanted it to be a family funeral to be shared by the people. From London, the cortege moved to the Spencer ancestral home, Althorp House, 77 miles away in the county of Northamptonshire. Diana was buried later that day on a beautiful island in the middle of an ornamental lake. It was her father's favourite spot.
Time is too slow for those who wait, too swift for those who fear, too long for those who grieve, too short for those who rejoice, but for those who love, time is eternity. If I should die and leave you here a while, be not like others, sore undone, who keep long vigils by the silent dusks and weep. For my sake, turn again to life and smile, nerving thy heart and trembling hand to do something to comfort other hearts than thine. Complete these dear unfinished tasks of mine, and I perchance may therein comfort you.
I think if one had to ask what legacy Diana left behind, it would be summed up in one word: love. The love she felt for her sons, the love she felt for the people she came in contact with, and particularly the love she felt for those who were suffering and lonely and hurt and in pain. That'll always stay with us. And if the one good thing can come out of it, it must be that hopefully we can carry on her work and the feeling she left behind us. Maybe the charities that she worked for will still benefit even though she's no longer with us. And maybe the boys will always remember the work she did, and they will carry it on, and they'll always remember the words of wisdom she spoke to them.
I think Diana meant an awful lot to people in this country, and a lot of us in this country didn't realise it at the time. And now she's gone, not only this country, but many people around the world took her to their hearts and included her as part of their everyday life.
I just feel that when she died, although I'd never met her, obviously, I felt like I'd lost a close friend. And I just found it was all terribly sad. I was glad that she had her last week of happiness with Dodi Al-Fayed, and I just feel so sorry for her two sons, the two princes.
At the family's Althorp estate in Northamptonshire, a short private service attended by the Spencer family, Prince Charles and Diana's sons, brought to an end this saddest of days. Diana was laid to rest wearing a formal, long-sleeved black dress with a rosary given to her by Mother Teresa. It is a place Diana loved as a child, and where she and her sisters and sons had planted oak trees for future generations to see and enjoy. It was chosen rather than the traditional Spencer burial place, the family chapel in the parish church of St. Mary the Virgin, so that sightseers would be deterred from laying constant siege to the quiet village of Great Brington.
Now William, as handsome a Prince Charming as his mother was a fairy tale princess, is being groomed to assume the ultimate role as head of the British royal family and to shape their destiny. And that is Princess Diana's ultimate legacy.